The morning sun had barely risen over Cedar Grove when Dr. Maya Thompson left her shift at Memorial Hospital. After 16 hours of back-to-back surgeries, her only thoughts were of a hot shower and her comfortable bed. She drove her black Mercedes carefully through the quiet streets, maintaining the speed limit as she always did. Officer James Miller sat in his patrol car, parked behind a large oak tree. It was his usual spot, a place other officers rarely chose. His mood was already dark, having received another warning from his supervisor about his aggressive behavior during traffic stops. This was his third warning this year, but Miller didn't care. In his mind, he was always right. As Dr. Thompson's car approached, Miller's eyes narrowed. The car was too nice for this neighborhood, he thought. Without hesitation, he pulled up behind her and turned on his lights. Dr. Thompson noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror and carefully pulled over, following all the proper procedures she'd learned over the years. She was tired but remained calm. At 42 years old, Dr. Thompson had dealt with similar situations before. As one of the few black female cardiac surgeons in the state, she had learned to handle prejudice with grace and dignity. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel and waited. Miller approached the car with his hand resting on his weapon, a completely unnecessary gesture for a simple traffic stop. He shone his flashlight directly into her face, even though the morning sun provided plenty of light. "License and registration," he barked, not even attempting to explain why he had pulled her over. "Good morning, officer," Dr. Thompson replied politely, keeping her voice steady. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Miller's face tightened. "I said license and registration. You can ask questions after you comply with my orders." Dr. Thompson slowly reached for her purse, narrating her movements. "I'm reaching for my purse to get my license." She then moved to the glove compartment. "Now I'm getting my registration from the glove compartment." She handed over the documents, and Miller snatched them from her hand. As he looked at her license, his eyebrows raised slightly. He hadn't expected to see doctor before her name, or her address in the expensive part of town. "You're a long way from home, doctor," he said, emphasizing her title with obvious sarcasm. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" "I'm actually heading home from work," she explained calmly. "I just finished my shift at Memorial Hospital. I'm a cardiac surgeon there." Miller scoffed. "Right, and I suppose you think that makes you special?" He hadn't run her plates yet, or even told her why she was stopped. His behavior was becoming increasingly unprofessional. Two residents from the neighborhood, Mrs. Jenkins and her daughter Sarah, were out for their morning walk. They slowed down as they passed, concerned by the officer's aggressive tone. Sarah discreetly took out her phone and started recording. "Officer," Dr. Thompson said firmly but respectfully, "I still don't know why I was pulled over. Could you please explain the reason for this stop?" Miller's face reddened. "You were swerving." "That's not true," Dr. Thompson replied, maintaining her composure. "I drive this route every day after my shifts. I'm always careful, especially when I'm tired after surgery." "Are you calling me a liar?" Miller's voice rose. His hand tightened on his belt. "No, officer, I'm stating facts. And at this point, I'd like your badge number and your supervisor's contact information." The situation was rapidly escalating, but not because of Dr. Thompson. She remained seated, hands visible, voice calm. It was Miller who was losing control, his face growing redder by the second. Mrs. Jenkins and Sarah had stopped walking entirely now, and other neighbors were beginning to peek out their windows. Miller leaned into the car window, his face uncomfortably close to Dr. Thompson's. "Listen here, I don't care what kind of doctor you claim to be. When I say you were swerving, you were swerving. Got it?" Dr. Thompson took a slow, deep breath. Years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her how to stay calm in tense moments. She reached for her phone, keeping it visible. "Officer Miller," she said, reading his nameplate. "I'm going to call your supervisor now. Your behavior is unprofessional, and I have the right to report it." The morning was about to take a turn that would change both their lives forever, though neither of them knew it yet. And somewhere in the background, Sarah's phone was still recording, capturing every moment of what would soon become a viral incident that would spark a nationwide conversation about police reform. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dr. Thompson sat calmly in her car, phone in hand, while Officer Miller's face turned an even darker shade of red. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street, where now at least 6 neighbors had gathered to watch the scene unfold. "Put that phone down," Miller shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. His hand was shaking, a detail that didn't escape Sarah Jenkins, who was still recording everything from the sidewalk. "I have the right to record this interaction," Dr. Thompson stated firmly. She had dealt with difficult situations in the operating room countless times, but this was different. Her heart was racing, though her voice remained steady. "I'm going to call your supervisor now." That's when something in Miller snapped. Perhaps it was the calm authority in Dr. Thompson's voice, or maybe it was the growing crowd of witnesses. Whatever the reason, what happened next would be replayed on news channels across the country. Miller reached through the car window, his face twisted with rage. "I said, put it down." Before anyone could react, his hand flew through the air, striking Dr. Thompson across the face with enough force to knock her phone onto the passenger seat. Gasps erupted from the gathered crowd. Sarah Jenkins let out a small scream but kept her phone steady, capturing every second. Her mother was already on the phone with 911. But Miller had made a serious mistake. What he didn't know was that Dr. Thompson had spent the last 5 years taking self-defense classes, a decision she made after working late nights at the hospital. She also didn't know that his body camera was recording everything, having been activated when he first turned on his patrol car's lights. In one fluid motion, Dr. Thompson blocked Miller's second attempt to grab her. Her training kicked in automatically. She caught his wrist, using his own momentum against him, and pushed his arm away from her face. Her movements were controlled and defensive, exactly as she had been taught. "I am defending myself against an unlawful assault," she announced clearly, making sure her words would be captured by both his body camera and the witnesses' phones. "I am not resisting arrest. I am protecting myself from an illegal attack." Miller stumbled backward, surprised by her skilled defense. His face showed shock, then embarrassment, then fury. He reached for his taser, but before he could grab it, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Miller, stand down." Officer Sarah Chen had just pulled up in her patrol car, responding to the multiple 911 calls from neighbors. She had worked with Miller before and knew about his history of complaints. She jumped out of her car, hand on her own weapon, but pointed at the ground. "Step away from the vehicle, Miller," Chen ordered, her voice firm and professional. "Now." 2 more patrol cars arrived, sirens wailing. Miller stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his taser. The small crowd had grown larger, with nearly every neighbor on the street now outside watching. Phones were recording from every angle. Dr. Thompson remained in her car, hands visible on the steering wheel, still completely calm despite the red mark forming on her cheek where Miller had struck her. She knew that staying calm was her best defense. "Officer Miller," she said loudly and clearly, "you just assaulted me without provocation. I'd like to press charges, and I want to speak to your supervisor immediately." Officer Chen approached the car carefully. "Ma'am, are you all right? Medical assistance is on the way." "I'm actually a doctor," Dr. Thompson replied, finally allowing herself a small smile. "I'll be fine, but I want everything documented." By now, Miller had backed away from the car, his face a mix of anger and fear as he realized what he had done. Officer Chen and another officer, James Rodriguez, moved to separate Miller from the scene. They could already see news vans approaching from the end of the street. "Your body camera was on, right?" Rodriguez asked Miller as he led him away. Miller's face went pale. He had forgotten about the camera. Everything, his unprovoked stop, his aggressive behavior, and most importantly, his assault on Dr. Thompson, had been recorded from his own perspective. The morning sun was now fully up, illuminating a scene that would soon become a turning point in the ongoing national conversation about police accountability. As Dr. Thompson waited for Miller's supervisor to arrive, she could already hear the news helicopters approaching overhead. This was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had ever faced abuse of power and stayed silent. The next 30 minutes on Cedar Grove Street turned into a scene of controlled chaos. Red and blue lights flashed from 5 police cars, an ambulance sat with its doors open, and 2 news vans had parked at opposite ends of the street. The morning air buzzed with voices, radio static, and the whirring of news helicopters overhead. Dr. Thompson sat on the back step of the ambulance while a paramedic, Tom Wilson, examined her face. The red mark from Miller's slap had started to darken into a bruise. Wilson held up a small light, checking her eyes for signs of concussion. "You know," Wilson said, "I recognize you, Dr. Thompson. You saved my father last year. That tricky heart surgery everyone else said was too risky." She smiled slightly, then winced at the pain in her cheek. "Mr. Wilson, right? How is your father doing?" "Better than ever," Wilson replied, carefully applying an ice pack to her face. "And now I get to help you, though I never thought it would be because of something like this." 20 feet away, Police Captain Diana Roberts had arrived on the scene. She was a tall woman with gray streaked hair and a reputation for zero tolerance toward officer misconduct. She watched the body camera footage on a laptop, her face growing darker with each passing second. "Play that part again," she commanded the tech officer. The footage showed Miller's hand striking Dr. Thompson, followed by her perfectly controlled defensive response. Captain Roberts had seen enough. She walked over to where Miller stood between Officers Chen and Rodriguez. His face had lost its angry red color and now looked pale and sickly. He knew his career was over. "Officer James Miller," Captain Roberts spoke loudly and clearly, making sure the gathering news crews could hear, "you are suspended effective immediately. Please surrender your badge and weapon." Miller's hands shook as he handed over his gun and badge. Captain Roberts wasn't finished. "Officers, please read him his rights and place him under arrest for assault under color of authority." The crowd that had gathered let out a collective gasp. It wasn't often they saw a police officer being arrested by his own colleagues. Sarah Jenkins, still recording everything, zoomed in as Officer Chen placed handcuffs on Miller's wrists. Meanwhile, Dr. Thompson's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Dr. Marcus Chen, the chief of surgery at Memorial Hospital, had seen the news and was already on his way with the hospital's legal team. The local NAACP chapter president had called twice, but the call she took was from her sister, Rachel. "Maya, I just saw the news. Are you okay?" Rachel's worried voice came through the speaker. "I'm fine," Dr. Thompson assured her. "Actually, those self-defense classes you kept pushing me to take really paid off." Captain Roberts approached Dr. Thompson, waiting respectfully until she finished her call. The captain's face showed genuine concern and professional determination. "Dr. Thompson," she began, "I want to personally apologize for Officer Miller's conduct. I've reviewed the body camera footage, and combined with witness videos, we have clear evidence of unprovoked assault. We're treating this with the utmost seriousness." Dr. Thompson nodded, still holding the ice pack to her face. "Thank you, Captain, but this isn't just about me. How many others has he done this to? People who maybe couldn't defend themselves or didn't have witnesses." The captain's face turned grim. "We're pulling his entire record. Every complaint, every traffic stop, every interaction. This stops here." The news crews had set up their cameras, and reporters were trying to get statements from witnesses. Mrs. Jenkins was describing what she saw to one reporter, her daughter Sarah showing them her phone footage. The video had already started spreading on social media. Dr. Marcus Chen arrived with 2 lawyers from the hospital's legal team. He rushed to Dr. Thompson, his face filled with concern for his star surgeon. "Maya, this is terrible, but you handled it brilliantly," he said, then turned to Captain Roberts. "I want it on record that Memorial Hospital stands fully behind Dr. Thompson. We'll provide whatever support is needed." As the morning wore on, the scene began to transform from a crisis into something else, a moment of change. People from nearby streets had gathered, holding hastily made signs supporting Dr. Thompson. Local community leaders were arriving. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become a catalyst for the reform many had been demanding for years. Dr. Thompson watched it all, still sitting on the ambulance step, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She was tired, her face hurt, but she knew this wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. By late afternoon, the story of Dr. Maya Thompson had exploded across social media. The video of Officer Miller slapping her and her controlled response had been viewed millions of times. Outside Memorial Hospital, where Dr. Thompson normally spent her days saving lives, a crowd of over 300 people gathered in peaceful protest. Marcus Williams, a local community organizer, stood on the hospital steps with a megaphone. "Today, we saw both the worst and the best of our city," his voice boomed across the crowd. "We saw abuse of power, but we also saw strength, dignity, and a community coming together. Behind him, hospital staff in white coats and scrubs lined the steps. Many held signs reading, "We stand with Dr. Thompson," and healers should never need protection from police. News cameras captured every moment as passing cars honked in support. Inside the hospital's conference room, Dr. Thompson sat with an impressive group of supporters. To her left was Patricia Jones, the president of the local NAACP chapter. To her right sat Ben Martinez, a civil rights attorney known for taking on police misconduct cases. Dr. Marcus Chen, still in his surgical scrubs, paced the room while talking on his phone. "The support is overwhelming," Dr. Thompson said, touching the ice back to her bruised cheek. "But this needs to be about more than just me." Patricia Jones nodded firmly. "It already is. We discovered 15 other complaints against Officer Miller in the past 3 years alone. Most of them were swept under the rug, but not this time." Ben Martinez spread several papers on the table. "Those other victims are coming forward now. Your case has given them courage. 3 of them have already agreed to testify about their experiences." Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Sarah Jenkins, whose video had gone viral, was being interviewed by a national news network. Her hands shook slightly as she held her phone, showing the reporter her footage. "I just knew I had to record it," Sarah explained. Dr. Thompson was so calm and professional, even when that officer was being aggressive. Then, when he hit her, Sarah's voice cracked with emotion, but the way she defended herself while stating her rights, it was powerful. Back in the conference room, Dr. Thompson's phone buzzed with another message. This one was from a young black female medical student at the university. "Dr. Thompson, watching you stand up for yourself with such dignity gives me hope. You're not just saving lives in the operating room anymore, you're saving our community." The door opened, and Captain Roberts entered with 2 internal affairs investigators. Their faces were serious but respectful. "Dr. Thompson," Captain Roberts began, "we finished our initial review. Officer Miller had his body camera turned off during several previous traffic stops, but we found enough evidence of a pattern. The department is preparing to make a formal announcement." Dr. Marcus Chen finally put down his phone. "The hospital board just finished their emergency meeting. They're offering full support, legal, medical, whatever you need. They're also launching a new program to train medical staff about their rights during police encounters." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Mrs. Jenkins, Sarah's mother, carrying a large box. "Dr. Thompson, these are letters from the neighborhood. Everyone wanted to share their stories and support. Some have lived with fear of Officer Miller for years." Dr. Thompson opened the box, pulling out handwritten letters, cards, and notes. One caught her eye, a crayon drawing from a little girl showing a figure in a doctor's coat standing strong against a mean-looking police officer. The words "my hero" were written in wobbly letters. Tears formed in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. Looking around the room at all these people ready to help create change, she felt a new kind of strength. "Okay," she said, standing up. "Let's make sure this never happens to anyone else. What's our next step?" Patricia Jones smiled. "The city council meeting is tomorrow. They've already added police reform to the agenda. We'd like you to speak." Outside, the crowd had started singing "We Shall Overcome." The sound drifted into the conference room, a powerful reminder that this moment was bigger than one incident, bigger than one doctor, bigger than one bad officer. It was about transforming pain into progress, fear into freedom. Dr. Thompson straightened her white coat and nodded. "I'll be there. We all will." The county courthouse stood tall and imposing on a bright Monday morning, its marble steps crowded with reporters, supporters, and curious onlookers. 2 weeks had passed since the incident, and today was Officer James Miller's first court appearance. Dr. Maya Thompson walked up those steps, surrounded by her legal team and supporters. Her bruise had faded, but the determination in her eyes burned brighter than ever. She wore a professional navy blue suit, her hospital ID still clipped to her lapel, a deliberate choice to remind everyone that she was both a victim and a respected medical professional. "Dr. Thompson, Dr. Thompson," reporters called out, pushing microphones toward her. "How do you feel about today's hearing?" Ben Martinez, her lead attorney, stepped forward. "Dr. Thompson will make a statement after the proceedings. For now, we're confident in our evidence and the justice system. Inside the courtroom, Officer Miller sat with his defense team, looking smaller without his uniform and badge. His face had grown pale and drawn over the past 2 weeks, especially after more victims had come forward with similar stories of abuse. Judge Maria Ramirez entered the courtroom, her reputation for fairness well known throughout the district. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and the packed courtroom stood. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Sandra Chen, laid out their evidence methodically. First, they played Miller's body camera footage. The sound of his hand striking Dr. Thompson echoed through the silent courtroom. Several people flinched. "Your Honor," Day Chen began, "we have clear evidence of assault under color of authority. But this isn't an isolated incident. We have documented 15 similar complaints against Officer Miller over the past 3 years. She gestured to a group of people sitting behind Dr. Thompson. "These 12 citizens are here today, ready to testify about their own experiences with Officer Miller. Each incident shows a pattern of aggressive behavior, racial bias, and abuse of power." Sarah Jenkins was called as the first witness. Now wearing her high school debate team pin for confidence, she described what she saw that morning. Her viral video played on the courtroom's large screen. "Dr. Thompson wasn't doing anything wrong," Sarah testified, her voice clear and strong. "Officer Miller got aggressive for no reason. When she asked for his badge number, he just hit her." The internal affairs investigator testified next, presenting their findings. "We discovered that Officer Miller had deliberately turned off his body camera during several traffic stops. However, dashboard camera footage from these incidents shows a disturbing pattern of behavior." During a brief recess, Dr. Thompson stood in the courthouse hallway with Patricia Jones from the NAACP. 2 of Miller's other victims approached them, an elderly black man walking with a cane and a young Hispanic college student. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson," the elderly man said, his voice shaking. "Last year, Miller roughed me up during a traffic stop. I filed a complaint, but nothing happened. Now, finally, someone's listening." Back in the courtroom, Miller's defense attorney tried to paint the incident as a momentary lapse in judgment due to job stress. Judge Ramirez listened with a stern expression, occasionally glancing at the growing stack of evidence files on her desk. "Your Honor," the defense attorney argued, "Officer Miller has served this community for 12 years. During which time, Judge Ramirez interrupted. "He accumulated more complaints than any other officer in the department. Please continue." Dr. Thompson finally took the stand. She spoke clearly and professionally, just as she did when presenting at medical conferences. She described the incident in detail, explaining how her self-defense training had allowed her to protect herself while clearly stating her rights. "This isn't about revenge," she testified, looking directly at Miller. "This is about accountability and change. No one should fear the people sworn to protect them." As the hearing concluded, Judge Ramirez made her position clear. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented today, this case will proceed to trial. Officer Miller will remain under house arrest, and his passport has been surrendered." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown even larger. Dr. Thompson stood before the microphones, her legal team and supporters behind her. "Today is just the beginning," she announced. "We're not just seeking justice for one incident. We're fighting for a system where power comes with responsibility, where a badge doesn't mean immunity, and where every person is treated with dignity regardless of their skin color." The crowd erupted in applause as the sun set behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps where justice was finally taking shape. 3 months after the incident, the Cedar Grove Police Department looked very different. The old frosted glass doors had been replaced with clear ones, a symbolic gesture of the department's new commitment to transparency. Inside, Chief Diana Roberts stood before a room full of officers, community leaders, and press members. "Today marks the beginning of our comprehensive reform program," Chief Roberts announced, standing next to a large screen showing the department's new policies. "What happened to Dr. Thompson showed us that change wasn't just needed, it was overdue. The changes were significant. Every patrol car now had updated camera systems that couldn't be turned off during stops. Officers wore new body cameras that activated automatically when they left their vehicles. But the biggest change was in the training room down the hall. There, Dr. Thompson herself stood before a group of 30 police officers. She had surprised everyone by agreeing to help with the department's new training program. Despite her busy schedule at the hospital, she felt this was equally important work. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty," she told the officers. "I'm here because we need to build trust between police and the community, and that starts with understanding each other." Officer Sarah Chen, who had helped stop Miller that day, now led the department's newly formed community relations unit. She stood up to share her perspective. "When I arrived at the scene that morning, I saw a fellow officer breaking everything we stood for," Chen said, her voice firm. "But you know what else I saw? I saw Dr. Thompson showing incredible restraint and professionalism. She became our teacher that day, whether she meant to or not." The training room walls now displayed new posters about de-escalation techniques, civilian rights, and proper procedures. But more importantly, the room had photos of community members, doctors, teachers, store owners, students, all people the officers were sworn to protect. In another significant change, the department had created a civilian oversight board. Mrs. Jenkins, Sarah's mother, sat on this board along with other community members. They reviewed body camera footage regularly and had real power to recommend disciplinary actions. Last week, Mrs. Jenkins shared with the group, "An officer came to me worried about his partner's aggressive behavior. Before, he might have stayed quiet. Now he knew he could speak up without fear. That's progress." The reforms weren't just about rules and cameras. The department had started regular community meetings in local neighborhoods. Officers were required to spend time volunteering in the areas they patrolled. They helped at food banks, coached youth sports teams, and attended community events out of uniform. Dr. Marcus Chen from Memorial Hospital had also joined the effort. The hospital and police department created a joint crisis response team, pairing officers with mental health professionals for certain emergency calls. "When I operate on a heart," Dr. Thompson explained to the officers, "I have a whole team watching vital signs, ready to alert me if something's wrong. You need the same kind of support system on the streets." Young Officer Mike Rodriguez raised his hand. "Some of us worried these changes would make our jobs harder," he admitted. "But it's actually the opposite. People trust us more now. They help us more. It's safer for everyone." The local police academy had completely revised its training program. New recruits now spend more time learning about community relations, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques. They also learned about the Miller incident as an example of what not to do and how one bad officer could damage community trust. Chief Roberts walked through the hallway where a new wall display showed the department's updated mission statement: to protect and serve with dignity, respect, and accountability. Below it hung a framed photo of Dr. Thompson speaking to the first class of officers under the new training program. 6 months ago, Chief Roberts told a visiting reporter, "We were making headlines for the wrong reasons." Today, police departments from across the country are calling us to learn about our reforms. Outside the station, Dr. Thompson got into her car after finishing another training session. A young officer held the door for her, the same door where Officer Miller had once stood with his hand on his weapon. The difference wasn't just in the policies or the cameras. It was in the attitudes, the understanding, and most importantly, the willingness to change. As she drove away, she passed a group of kids playing basketball with 2 off-duty officers in the community park. They waved at her, and she smiled. This was what real community policing looked like. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Maria Ramirez prepared to announce her verdict. 6 months had passed since that morning on Cedar Grove Street, and now the trial of former Officer James Miller had reached its conclusion. The room was packed with reporters, community members, and police officers in plain clothes. Dr. Maya Thompson sat in the front row, her sister Rachel holding her hand tightly. Behind her sat Sarah Jenkins and her mother, along with many of Miller's other victims who had come forward to testify during the trial. Miller sat at the defense table, looking much older than he had 6 months ago. His police uniform had been replaced by a gray suit that seemed too big for his now thinner frame. His hands trembled slightly as Judge Ramirez cleared her throat. "In the case of the state versus James Miller," Judge Ramirez began, her voice clear and firm, "this court has reviewed all evidence, including body camera footage, witness testimonies, and the defendant's history of misconduct. The evidence shows a disturbing pattern of abuse of power spanning several years." She paused, looking directly at Miller. "Mr. Miller, you were given a badge to protect and serve. Instead, you used it as a shield for misconduct and as a weapon against the very people you swore to protect. The judge continued, "This court finds you guilty of assault under color of authority, misconduct in office, and violation of civil rights. I hereby sentence you to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release." A collective gasp filled the room. It was rare for a police officer to receive prison time for misconduct. Judge Ramirez wasn't finished. Additionally, you are permanently banned from serving in any law enforcement capacity. You must also complete 500 hours of community service, specifically working with organizations that assist victims of police misconduct. Miller's shoulders slumped as 2 court officers approached to take him into custody. As they led him past Dr. Thompson's row, he paused briefly. "Dr. Thompson," he said quietly, speaking to her for the first time since that morning, "I'm sorry, I was wrong." Dr. Thompson nodded once, acknowledging his words but offering no verbal response. She had already said everything she needed to during her powerful testimony. Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Sandra Chen held a press conference. "Today's verdict sends a clear message. No one is above the law. A badge is not a license for abuse. It's a symbol of responsibility and trust." The civil lawsuit that followed brought more changes. The city agreed to a substantial settlement, but Dr. Thompson insisted that most of the money go toward establishing a victims' support fund for others who had faced similar abuse. "Money can't undo what happened," she explained to reporters, "but it can help create systems to prevent it from happening again." The police department's insurance company, facing the large payout, demanded better oversight and training procedures for all officers. What had started as one incident had sparked a chain reaction of accountability across the entire system. Later that evening, Dr. Thompson returned to her normal shift at Memorial Hospital. As she walked through the emergency room, she passed Officer Sarah Chen bringing in an elderly patient. The 2 women exchanged knowing smiles. Chen was now leading the department's new community policing initiative. "Dr. Thompson," a young nurse called out, "your patient in room 204 is asking about you. He's nervous about his surgery tomorrow." She headed to room 204, where she found a teenage boy looking anxious. His father sat beside him, and she recognized him as one of Miller's other victims who had testified at the trial. "Doctor," the father said, standing to shake her hand, "when I learned you would be doing my son's surgery, I knew he would be in good hands. You helped bring justice to our community. Now you're helping save my boy's life." Dr. Thompson checked the boy's vital signs while explaining the procedure in simple, calming terms. This was why she had fought so hard, not just for justice, but for the right to continue serving her community without fear. As she left the room, her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "Saw the verdict on the news. You did it, sis. You really did it." Dr. Thompson smiled as she put on her surgical mask, ready for another night of saving lives. Justice had been served, but her work, both in medicine and in advocacy for change, was far from over. And that was exactly how it should be. 1 year had passed since that life-changing morning on Cedar Grove Street. Dr. Maya Thompson stood at a podium in the city's main conference center, addressing a room full of police cadets, veteran officers, and community leaders from across the country. "Change doesn't come from one incident," she said, her confident voice carrying through the room. "It comes from how we respond to that incident and what we choose to do afterward." The conference was titled Building Trust, Police and Community United, and it had drawn participants from 50 different cities. What had happened in Cedar Grove had become a model for police reform nationwide. Sarah Jenkins, now a freshman in college studying criminal justice, sat in the front row. Her viral video from that morning played on the large screen behind Dr. Thompson, but now it was being used as a teaching tool rather than evidence of wrongdoing. "Look at the difference a year makes," Dr. Thompson continued, gesturing to Officer Sarah Chen, who now stood beside her. Last year, Officer Chen had to arrest one of her fellow officers. Today, she leads our city's most successful community policing program. Officer Chen stepped forward to share her own experiences. "We've had 0 incidents of excessive force this year," she reported proudly. "Our complaint rates are down by 85%, and citizen cooperation has increased by 70%. In the audience, Mrs. Jenkins nodded in approval. As head of the Civilian Oversight Board, She had watched these changes happen firsthand. Her board now included teachers, social workers, and even a high school student representative. The reforms had spread beyond just the police department. Memorial Hospital, where Dr. Thompson still performed life-saving surgeries, had created a special program to treat victims of trauma from police encounters. They offered both physical and mental health support, with costs covered by the victims' fund established from her lawsuit settlement. Last month, Dr. Thompson shared, "I operated on a patient who told me something interesting. He said he used to be scared when he saw police cars in his neighborhood. Now, he waves to the officers because he knows them by name. They coach his kids in basketball and help at the community garden." Former Officer James Miller's case had also created lasting change. The state legislature had passed the Thompson Act, requiring all police departments to implement similar reforms: better training, civilian oversight, and automatic body camera activation during all encounters. As Dr. Thompson concluded her speech, a young black female police cadet raised her hand. "Dr. Thompson, what made you decide to work with the police department instead of just winning your case and moving on?" Dr. Thompson smiled, remembering all the moments that had led to this one. "In the operating room, when something goes wrong, we don't just treat the symptoms. We fix the underlying problem. That's what we're doing here, treating the whole system, not just one incident." After the conference, Dr. Thompson walked through the renovated police training facility. The walls now displayed photos of successful community police partnerships, officers reading to elementary school children, joining neighborhood cleanup events, and attending cultural celebrations. In one classroom, a familiar face caught her attention. It was James Miller, now released from prison, speaking to a group of cadets about his mistakes and what he had learned. Part of his rehabilitation included sharing his story as a warning to others. "Dr. Thompson," he acknowledged her presence respectfully. "I was just telling these cadets about how one moment of lost control can destroy trust that took years to build." She nodded and continued her tour. In another room, she found Officer Chen teaching de-escalation techniques using virtual reality headsets, technology purchased with grant money the department had received for its innovative reforms. As the day ended, Dr. Thompson drove home along Cedar Grove Street. She passed the spot where everything had happened a year ago. Now, a community garden stood there, jointly maintained by police officers and neighborhood residents. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Saw you on the news again, sis. Mom would have been so proud." Dr. Thompson smiled, thinking of her mother who had always taught her to stand up for what was right. As she parked her car, she noticed two police officers helping an elderly woman with her groceries. One of them waved, and she waved back. This was the real victory. Not just justice served, but trust rebuilt. Not just reforms written, but relationships restored. One morning of violence had led to a year of healing, and now, finally, to lasting change.